Good morning and welcome to the WITA webinar on fair and clean trade in steel and aluminum. If you'll just give us a moment for folks to load into the session, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are, wherever you're joining us from, and welcome to WITA's event on fair and clean trade in steel and aluminum. With what's happening in Ukraine today, I know we were all a bit distracted, and we're pleased to have you with us here today. Before we get to today's event, a couple quick announcements. Upcoming on Friday, March 11th, WITA will be hosting the 4 trade councils from the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees. This is an annual event that we will once again take place online this year. In fact, watching it live on Zoom is the only way you can see this off-the-record program, which will not be broadcast again after it is shown live from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. on March 11th. Also, yesterday we announced that the 2022 WITA WITA-WITF annual dinner will take place this year in person on Wednesday, July 13th. This event sells out every year, so if your organization is interested in sponsoring WITA, please contact Diego Añez. His email we'll try to post in the chat. If you've attended any of our nearly 120 webinars these past 2 years, you know we like to call out the names of those you are in community with at today's event, even if you cannot see them online. So welcome today to Marcia Miller with ArcelorMittal, Chuck Johnson with the Aluminum Association of America, Jean Simard with the Aluminum Association of Canada, Yasushi Naito with the Japan Aluminum Association, and Gerd Gotz with the European Aluminum Association. Welcome, Marcia, Charles, John, Yasushi, and Gerd, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, which we'll try to get to toward the latter part of today's event. You should have also received a copy of our speakers' biographies by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. We have a terrific event today that really bridges several issues at the forefront of interest to WITA members, including trade law and sustainable trade. For the past 2 years, we've been hosting a series of events on trade and the environment sponsored by Silverado Policy Accelerator, and we're pleased to look at a critical issue that hasn't gotten as much attention as other issues in this space, the environmental impact of subsidies in steel and aluminum. We're delighted to welcome today Buddy Stemple, Chief Executive Officer of Constellium Rolled Steel Products and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Aluminum Association. Welcome, Buddy. Julia Nielson, Deputy Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. Welcome back, Julia, who's been a guest at past WITA webinars and at our live events in Washington, D.C. Welcome as well to Alan Price, Partner and Chair of the Trade Practice at Wiley Rein, LLP. Alan and his team at Wiley Rein have been longtime collaborators with WITA, and we're very grateful to have him here on today. And I'd note that while Alan represents several U.S. steel and aluminum firms, his comments today are his own and should not be associated with any individual client. And also welcome back an old friend, our moderator, Ken Ash, visiting fellow at the Institute for International Trade in Adelaide and former OECD Director of Trade and Agriculture. Ken has been a frequent guest at WITA over the years, and we're delighted to welcome you back. Ken?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be back. Not quite in Washington, but at WITA virtually. And can I just add my own appreciation to you and to your team, not just for this event, but the other 120 that you managed to make happen in the middle of a global pandemic. So well done. It is a pleasure to be here. So as Ken has pointed out, the interest is in looking at the full range of issues that affect both steel and aluminum sectors. We want to begin by having a conversation with the panel around the economic and the financial implications of very high levels of state subsidies in these sectors. but also at the same time to pay more attention than has been paid to date to the environmental impacts of state subsidies. And of course, we want to spend some time looking at possible ways forward. So what are some of the solutions? So that's more than enough from me. I want to turn to the panel right away. And Julia, if I could begin with you. You and your team at the OECD have produced some terrific work on the nature, the scale, the sources of industrial subsidies. Can you give us the highlights?
Sure, and it's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody. So we've been looking at subsidies across sectors, across agriculture, fossil fuels, fish, for many years, and more recently industrials. We've done deep dives on aluminium and semiconductors, and also looked at below market finance. So what I'm saying is going to draw on all of that work. 7 quick points. Firstly, subsidies are big in industrial sectors. They're very big. It's a big issue. But the nature and scale of that activity varies enormously. There are many players who are at it, but not everybody is the same. Secondly, you really need to look along the value chain, because support builds along the value chain. Sometimes that you don't see a lot of subsidy action in a finished good, which is often where the trade problem is, but that's because the upstream inputs are heavily subsidised and they're 80% of the cost of the final good. Equally, we see combinations of measures. So an export restriction of an input produced in the domestic market serves effectively to subsidise domestic firms. The third thing we found is that state-owned enterprises are not just important recipients of support, they're important providers of support, and be that cheap energy through state-owned power utilities or cheap loans through government-owned or influenced financial institutions. And in fact, we actually talk about government-invested firms rather than state-owned enterprises, because the problem starts at firms with well below 50% government ownership. The fourth point is that, and it's a related one, is that support takes many forms. And one of the forms that we found, because we didn't look at what governments gave, we looked at what firms received. And one of the things that we found in doing that was that firms were receiving a lot of below market loans, so loans at below market interest rates, and also what we call below market equity injections from governments. And that's not just the one-off equity injection, that's the ongoing support effect when the government stays in, when a private investor would have long left a non-performing firm. Fifth point, focusing really on these below market loans, so these cheap loans, is that we see that they're particularly prevalent in heavy industries. So we see them in steel, we see them in aluminium, and we see them particularly in sectors where there are issues and debates about capacity that is beyond what one would normally expect to see given market conditions. In our work, we also see that there's some correlation between the receipt of those below market loans and investments in additional capacity in those fixed assets and capacity additions. So 2 last points. Firms with government ownership, and that can be from 25% onwards, receive more of these kinds of loans. They receive more below market loans, and they also receive more government grants than other kinds of loans. And that's true across a range of sectors for firms with more than 25% government ownership. But I guess the key finding, and this is the one I'll finish on, is that transparency is a huge issue. Knowing where the state is, so that you know whether a firm, what looks like a transaction between 2 private parties is in fact, has the state involved, where is the state, but also simply what's going on, that nature and scale question. We resorted to looking through, having bright young things plough through the internet for years at a time, finding what firms received, because if you want to look at what governments give, you can't find it anywhere. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Julia. So about 600 pages of analytical reports in 4 minutes. So thank you for that. I want to turn to the industry folks right away and begin with you, Alan, just to get your sense of whether that picture that Julia has painted is consistent with your own experience, but in particular to perhaps say a little bit more about the impacts that these kinds of subsidies are having on businesses and on markets in steel. Alan?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ken, and thank you, everyone. First, I want to thank WITA for hosting the event, and I think it is important to combine these issues. For so long, environment or lack of environmental compliance in certain countries became a basis of comparative advantage in trade, and subsidies also feed into that. So I think it's time to really combine these areas, and this webinar is an excellent opportunity. Also want to thank the OECD. Actually, I've worked with the Steel Committee for about 20 plus years, and so I know that environment very well, but I've also worked periodically with the Trade Committee, particularly in aluminium and the aluminium report that was prepared. As you look at the effects of subsidies and excess capacity, I think we have to acknowledge that these have been an issue that have gone on for many, many decades. But you have to start with the greatest, sort of most recent set of issues that have had the greatest impact out there. And those, I think a lot of us would say, would start with China. When you look at the nature and scale of the subsidies that were out there, had a dramatic effect. And I think a lot of those subsidies we have had been strategic, and you see them in steel, you see them in aluminum, but you see the exact same patterns in solar, you see the same patterns in semiconductors. It is in large capacity, do it in a way where the capital costs are non-existent or low, collapse pricing down because the capital costs are low, collapse input costs are down for everything, so you have downstream effects in downstream industries, and you end up having market-based players in countries, whether it's in Europe or the United States or Canada or elsewhere, ultimately unable to compete because prices drop below levels where companies can remain competitive. Okay, and so in many ways, you see these subsidies have a pernicious effect. And as a result of that, you see disinvestment in many of these industries, and you see that actually in both the steel and aluminium industries that for many years could not invest properly in the primary portions of their production, and that has had a devastating effect out there. And the legal solutions that we see often result in trade remedy cases out there and other national security cases and other things. But their fundamental core and the fundamental problems throughout these issues are the same. And ultimately, you have a set of problems out there. And while China, we all quickly look at and say, oh, it's a China problem first. And I've spent a lot of time analyzing the China problem and working on it for the last 20 years. If you go back before that, and if you go back after it, there's a variety, as Julia points out, you see what I will call knock-on subsidies going on, right? So other countries, for their own reasons, will engage in subsidization and to keep their industries alive. And too often, you see industries survive or not survive based upon the levels of subsidies. And we see that throughout the steel industry. And we see, unfortunately, which we'll come to in the next discussion, a potentially new round of subsidies going in. And the one thing I will say is that environment is a constant excuse for subsidies. So as we looked at China and pulled apart all of the information on Chinese subsidies, a lot of them are cloaked in environmental terms. And so we just have to be mindful of all of that. You can reduce your per ton amount of pollution, whether it's CO2 emissions or anything else, but add to the overall problem by constantly enlarging total capacity and having devastating price effects, undercutting competitive producers.
Thank you, Alan. Buddy, I'd like to turn to you now, and essentially the same question, but from the perspective of the aluminium sector. So give us your sense, if you could, of the major impacts that subsidies are having on businesses and on markets in aluminium.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Just a small correction to my introduction. Constellium is an aluminum producer, not a steel producer. So gotta set that straight. Yeah, the distortions in the international markets have been growing for some time. We've seen recently they serve to weaken our domestic supply chains for many products that are vital to national security and our economic security. From the aluminum standpoint, over the last 20 years, China has surged from being a relatively minor global player to becoming the world's largest producer, accounting for nearly 60% of global output today. Much of that growth was driven by massive state subsidies that benefited the Chinese production at the expense of jobs and expansion that Alan alluded to in the United States and North America. Put things into perspective that here at home, there are 660,000 direct and indirect aluminum jobs that total over $44 billion a year. So that's the magnitude of what is at stake. If you look on into Europe, Canada, and Japan, those numbers increase by a factor of 3. And while the rest of the world curtailed and shuttered primary capacity, subsidies allowed the Chinese not only to keep their capacity, but to grow. And the knock-on effects we mean as an industry, we've been forced to treat the symptoms through the use of our anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws while relying on our government partners to address the root cause. I think the good news is that the robust trade enforcement efforts by both the government and industry have driven investments over the most recent years. I'll give you an example. Over the past decade, the aluminum industry has invested more than $4 billion in the United States, including $800 million in just the last 6 months, strongly on the back of anti-dumping countervailing duty rulings.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to jump right away into issues around the environment and climate in particular. So Julia, let me come back to you. Does the OECD have any analysis that you can share with us on the impact of industrial subsidies on the environment and on climate? I know you have not published a lot, but I'm pretty sure you have some work in progress, so we're maybe going to push you a little bit on this one. Julia?
Okay, thanks for the warning. So my plan to pivot to our general work on this area is not going to work. But I would like to highlight that the issue of sort of what we would call environmentally harmful subsidies is a growing one for us across sectors. I mean, we've clearly got issues where we're talking about fossil fuel subsidies or fish, but also in subsidies that people also think about as subsidizing a good thing, like agriculture, where we see some environmental impacts. It's also a big question for us on our work on industrial subsidies. And yes, it is something that we've started to look at. And there's two sorts of issues here. One that we're looking at very specifically at the moment, which is of this government support that we know about, that we've been looking at, including in sectors like aluminium and steel. What do we know about the impacts on the environment, and particularly in greenhouse gases? But I think there's also another issue that we will look at sort of more broadly, is that we're seeing increasingly a need for subsidies or subsidies claiming to encourage greener practices, to encourage better environmental practices. So, what do we know about the design of that kind of work, that kind of support, and is it actually having the impact that we think? Because as we know, of course, that there is always, nobody ever says, this is my re-election subsidy. There's always another reason for a subsidy. It's always going to contribute to something else. So unpacking that and finding out that you're getting what you pay for, including with environmental benefits, is very important. So, as we start to look at this on industrial subsidies and environmental impacts, I mean, obviously there's a couple of channels that we're exploring. Clearly, to the extent that subsidies are greatly increasing production, then that would suggest that, normally you'd see a scale effect and you would probably be increasing emissions as well. That also depends, though, on the type of production that your subsidies are encouraging. And it depends what technology is being used, what inputs are being used, and that's going to impact that relationship that we're trying to see in empirical work between that government support and the environmental impacts on emissions. The other question, though, which is related, is what's the record of this support that is currently being given in encouraging or leading to better use of more green or environmental practices and technology as well. So that's another issue that we're looking at, is that relationship or correlation between the support and more use of green and better technologies. So this is it is work in progress. These things are sort of intuitive, or there are arguments, but actually trying to find the empirical analysis and the evidence is what we're trying to do at the OECD on that issue.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, this space has enough philosophy and religion, I think. So, keep after the evidence. That's a good way to go. So let me go back to the industry folks, but I want to begin with Buddy this time. Look, you're working in an energy-intensive, trade-exposed sector. You're confronting, not just competition from state subsidies, but you're trying to find a way to move towards net zero emissions in due course. Are there viable pathways open to you today, Buddy? I think you're muted, Buddy. You need to turn off your.
Spent half my life on mute. Yes, there are. Both governments and the private sector need to do more to achieve this ambitious climate policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's important to note, however, that distortions in the international aluminum markets matter not only for the business, but also the environment, as we know. Subsidies tend to encourage extraction, production, processing, and export in greenhouse gas emitting production systems based largely on the fossil fuels. As China's share of the global production grew, so did its share of the industry's total CO2 emissions, from 12% in the year 2000 to 71% in 2021. Nearly 90% of China's production relies on coal-generated electricity, which emits 10 times as much CO2 per ton of aluminum compared to the hydropower-based systems common in the rest of the world and including North America. Subsidies also discourage development of energy-saving and waste-reducing recycling systems. This is particularly important as aluminum is 100% recyclable, and recycling requires just 5% of the energy required to produce a pound of primary metal. Regional variations in aluminum production drive significant differences in the overall carbon footprint of various aluminum products. An aluminum beverage can, car hood, a gutter made using primary metal from China, for example, is a very different proposition compared to one using North American metal in terms of its environmental impact. According to the association's latest LCA report, the difference in metal input has a significant impact in the carbon footprint of the final aluminum product, whether an extrusion, a building sheet, or a pickup truck. Making these products with primary aluminum from regions like China and the Middle East, which rely largely on coal and natural gas-based electricity, can be 2 to 3 times as carbon intensive as making similar products in North America, even using similar products of recycled aluminum. In North America, the carbon impact of producing a pound of primary aluminum has dropped by nearly half over the last 30 years, and a pound of recycled aluminum declined 60%, all done during a period when aluminum demand grew 25%. The industry is innovating to further reduce carbon impact of primary production, as an example, the inert anode, and well-designed policies are key to not further distort the international trade markets that risk exacerbating trade tensions without improving the climate outcomes.
Thank you, Buddy. That's a pretty robust story. Alan, I know you've got some thoughts, deeply felt, that you want to come in now.
Certainly. So first of all, the U.S. steel industry is the cleanest of any of the major steel industries in the world in terms of CO2 emissions, and that's because it is heavily a recycling industry. And it achieved this with minimal subsidization. And in fact, one might argue that the first stage of sort of the cap and trade program in the EU actually retarded and kept in place incumbents that were used more pollutive technologies because they still used more CO2 intensive technologies. Obviously, China is the most CO2 intensive. An inherent part of steel, if you're using primary production, is the process. The steel making process itself fundamentally involves carbon. And there is what you have to recognize is the virgin unit problem, which is whether or not you're talking about steel or ultimately aluminum, you need a certain amount of virgin units, and no matter what, and those will have to come from somewhere. And that's where the fundamental challenges exist of how do you decarbonize that and get that done. It's important that we take steps to make sure that we continue on these paths, and these paths are challenging. Okay, there is only so much hydropower, and in fact, we've seen many facilities and hydropower locations closed down because they were undercut, for example, by Chinese pricing in the marketplace, or by subsidies even within North America. And so we just have to be mindful that there are solutions here, but we have to look at these as layered solutions to achieve these. There will be technology that's required in certain areas that technologies are not there, and in certain areas, the key issues will become what is the energy grid, right? Because at a certain point, I would say that I can look at two plants in the aluminium industry, and if I use a tool that is out there that looks at CO2 intensity in the United States, it would basically say one company has the cleanest plant in the United States, and one company has the dirtiest plant in terms of CO2 emissions in the United States. And the only difference in the core difference is probably their electricity grid at this point. So there is a fundamental set of issues out there of how do we deal with improving the environment, minimizing subsidized distortion so that the market actually works, and achieving the positive goals. And sometimes government assistance, unfortunately, distorts the market, and often, and will continue to do so, and has often been counterproductive to the environment. And even if it is productive in a certain way, it undercuts those who are market-based players in the marketplace. And we see that going on over and over again. So.
Okay, I want to stay with the industry folks, and Alan, I'm going to come back to you roughly where you ended. In fact, I think there's a reasonably clear and widely understood description of the problem, both from an economic and a financial perspective, and increasingly from the point of view of the environment. So what is it governments should do? We talk about a level playing field. Absent a level playing field, it's hard to imagine where the private investment is going to be incentivized to move towards net zero. So what's your advice, Alan? What should governments do to level the playing field, and what can companies themselves do?
So, listen, I think in terms of governments, I think we have to think about what governments very carefully are doing. What is not useful is for governments to invest and fund technology that is off the shelf in the steel industry. For example, governments funding conversion to electric furnaces and direct reduction iron, which is standard technology that exists, and people should do it on a market basis. And we see a rash of subsidization going on right now in Europe and Canada, where governments are stepping in to do that. And everyone's called a demonstration project. Every single country in Europe seems to be running through a demonstration project doing the exact same thing. What is fundamentally needed and useful is dealing with the grid. Okay, that is a set of issues that is fundamental, and we see that today, sadly, in Europe right now, when we see that energy dependency is a key issue to its competitiveness, and we need to get the grid cleaned up, because that and adequate amounts of clean energy from reliable sources that can run 24/7. Because if you're many of these production technologies, whether you're a steel mill or an aluminum smelter, you have to really run 24/7. You can't go up and down when the sun goes up and down or the wind stops blowing. So we need to address some of those key areas, and I think that should be a key focus. Obviously, there's key areas are fundamental research. Okay, I mean, there are areas to decarbonize that are to get to net zero. There are still challenges out there in steelmaking where fundamental research is needed. Okay, not everyone doing a demonstration project, but real research for solving problems. And I think the other key area that we see is, making sure that whatever incentives are out there tend to be generally available. Okay, so that it is, it's not picking and choosing in the marketplace really working. With regard to certain policies out there, and I think Julia touched on this, we have to be very careful regarding what we are concerned about our scrap in the steel area, and it applies in the aluminum area. If you look at scrap policies and raw material hoarding, we're starting to see that creep up as a real problem, and the European wage shipment regulations are a real concern there. Okay, that those may be in fact just a hidden subsidy. Carbon border adjustment is critically important, I think a lot of people would tell you, and it is very difficult to conceive of in a WTO consistent way. To be blunt about it, I've spent a lot of time looking at it, and there are some people who are now saying we really have to move on from what are concepts that may be very difficult to adapt to, particularly since a lot of it is driven by market requirements, and yet people will be undercut by polluting countries who are on a different timetable in terms of CO2 emissions. And so it's important to have some type of border adjustment mechanism, but how it is done is going to be a real challenge, and doing it in if we have to require multilateral consistency, it's particularly challenging from a legal perspective. So, one of the things the governments can do is address these problems. Companies obviously are going to work to respond to the marketplace, and I think they have to continue their leadership in doing so. And I think you see great leadership going on by a number of companies in this regard. And so in the steel area, you have seen fantastic leadership by companies in the United States in leading recycling efforts, in leading efforts for direct reduction technologies, and so forth. And so companies will continue to invest. The key is that they have adequate returns from that are not subsidized, so that they can make market-based decisions here and get this done. And we need to understand that they will have failures in doing so. That some technologies people are going to play with are not going to work. We'll need to understand that lifespans of equipment are going to be shortened in many cases, because you're going to have to keep on reinvesting. And so they need returns for that, and they're going to need to be able to respond to client-driven requirements for new types of product, because that's all part of this. Is that at the end of the day, so today's steel is not yesterday's steel, and so that's all part of it. So that's, companies can do their part of this. Governments really need to create the right environment so that they can earn the right levels of returns to make these investments that they all need. And critically, governments need to focus on electricity grids incredibly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Lots there to think about for sure. Buddy, from the perspective of the aluminium value chain, what's your view? What should governments do to level the international playing field, and what can companies do?
Well, I agree with a lot of the things that Alan said there. And, the solutions are going to be different, whether you're looking at scope 1, scope 2, scope type 3 emissions. And I think they require, a different solution as well. I think there's a big difference between aluminum and steel and what the issues are. But I think when you come from what governments can do, I think there's specifically 3 things. One, we need to update the WTO rules on industrial subsidies. The WTO should update its rules to discipline countries that engage in non-market oriented practices, including massive and harmful state subsidies. Such an effort would be a significant undertaking, but is likely the most effective long-term solution to combat market distorting behavior. Secondly, I think it's strong trade enforcement. Countries should continue to use the available trade enforcement remedies to accommodate unfair trade practices in relevant markets. Governments in the US, Europe, Canada, and Japan have all made substantial use of trade enforcement tools in recent years, and these efforts should continue. And third, I think we've got to have multilateral engagement. The US, EU, Japan trilateral partnership, the US, EU Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, US, EU Trade and Technology Council, and the Global Trade Challenges Working Group have all highlighted the challenges of market distorting behavior in aluminum trade. These groups must now work toward concrete policy solutions to address the challenges that they've identified. And Ken, I really think if we act together, we can ensure a reliable supply of responsibly produced aluminum in line with the future demand.
Thank you, buddy. We may want to come back briefly on a couple of those points, but Julia, you will get the last word, at least from the part of the session, I think that I'm going to be moderating, and we'll turn over to Ken Levinson in about 10 minutes, or maybe a little bit less. But your perspective, if a government were to ask you, what would you tell them, Julia?
Well, aside from saying that I agree with much of what's already been said, I mean, to pick up a few points, I think one of the things going forward, especially on looking at this combination of the market and trying to get the environmental win-wins, is you want governments, you want companies to see being green as a source of competitive advantage. Not just because that's the way governments are regulating, but because that's where consumer demand is and that's where it's going. But in order for firms to want to do that, they have to be operating in a market that's functioning and in a market that works. So, from that perspective, very much I would support the call for effective multilateral WTO rules. To me, that's a first best solution for a simple reason that when you're dealing with government support, and this applies to a range of sectors, you really want to do 4 things. You want transparency, so you know what's going on. You want predictability, so you want some kind of lock-in. You want reduction. But most importantly, you also want prevention. You want prevention of tomorrow's subsidizers in tomorrow's sectors. And a lot of other arrangements can give you the first 3, but only multilateral trade rules can give you all 4. So I'd argue very strongly for that. The second thing I would call for is the first of those, more investment in transparency. Transparency of what's happening in markets, transparency in your own market as well, because this is what allows people to know what's going on. So it's what allows also the public and the taxpayer who pay for these subsidies to be able to say, are we getting what we think we're paying for? So subsidy reform starts with transparency. I think the third thing as well in the current environment is don't make it worse. There are many new reasons that we're seeing for subsidies. Subsidies is a growth industry. And some of those reasons have some, legitimate bases. But how and when you intervene and in what way really matters. And we're seeing a lack of attention to really ensuring ongoing competitive markets and a lack of attention to those opportunity costs for scarce public money, which is needed if we're going to have a greener and more digital future. I think the last thing, as well as fixing up the trade rules, is also continuing to cooperate not just on trade and on subsidy reform, but also on climate and climate ambition, because I think those kinds of cooperative extent, where people try to come to an understanding of different contributions that countries can make in their different ways, with moving towards a level of ambition that's going to get us where we need to be, is a fundamental part, I think, of this global level playing field. So action multilaterally on the subsidies, action domestically with better policies and don't make it worse, and also action to cooperate on climate. Thanks.
Thank you. In fact, thank all of the panelists. There's a remarkable degree of commonality. You have all identified similar problems, but also different problems across aluminium and steel. You've identified similar solutions, similar interests in solutions, but again, some differences. And I guess I'd just like to underscore two points, and then maybe ask the panel an unanticipated question, if Ken Levinson doesn't come on and cut me off. But this issue of making things worse. I mean, Julie, I'm glad you raised that, because I think there look to be big risks. Alan, you raised CBAMs. I mean, in principle, a CBAM can be a wonderful thing. In practice, we haven't seen a wonderful thing yet called a CBAM. So there are some rather significant risks associated with, attempts to pursue legitimate, important, in fact, essential environmental objectives. So how you do it really matters. And the other issue is, while there are distortions in markets, and while there's uncertainty, and while businesses don't quite know what's going to happen next, they tend to leave money in the mattress. And the amount of investment that's required, the International Aluminium Institute has produced some really interesting work looking on pathways to 2050. And the amount of private investment that's required is enormous, and it's not going to happen if the conditions aren't right, if the returns aren't likely to be there. So I guess I just want to go back to Buddy and to Alan. If there's any final word that you want to make with respect to, you've got 30 seconds in the elevator with whatever minister responsible or whatever president that you're in the elevator with. What's your message to him or her? If I could start with you, Buddy.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I said, I would say simply, hey, this is the right thing to do. We all need to be working together, but we also need to understand that, this is going to take some time. And I think what we're clearly missing is we're missing a plan and a pathway to get where we want to. All right. We're taking things far too fast, much faster than the technology is available out there and those type of things. And we're going to have a whole bunch of unintended consequences when we look up here in another 12 to 24 months. This is something we all want to do. We all need to do. We need to have a plan to get there and work on it together.
I'm glad I went back to you. Alan, final word? Sorry, Alan, you're muted, unfortunately.
Okay, so I agree with Buddy entirely. There is a critical need for a plan, and it starts with the most fundamental building blocks here. And it's great that we're all rushing around trying to do the stuff, but there's technology needs, there are energy grid needs, and we are already seeing lots of unintended consequences that need to be addressed out there. And you can see it in Europe right now with energy prices ravaging production of these products right now. And so it is just a critical area. And the other key message I would say in this is that it's got to be done in a way that that makes sure the market fundamentally works and doesn't get hurt by the fact that at the end of the day there's an election perhaps in Canada, so someone builds a plant that's larger than the plant they're supposedly cleaning up, which is literally what's going on right now, okay? In one of those cases in the name of the environment with standard technologies. So we've got to get to something that really improves the environment and doesn't distort the marketplace for the companies that are market-based at the end of the day.
Thank you, Alan. Julia, did you want to take a ride up in that elevator or not? I don't want to put you, you're okay? All right. Look, thank you, all of you. It's been fascinating. It's been interesting. I've learned a lot and I've had a lot of fun. Now back to Ken Levinson, who's going to do the hard part.
Don't go anywhere, Ken. May have some questions that we may call you in on as well. We have several coming in from the audience. I do want to invite a special guest to join us. Jean Samar from the Aluminum Association of Canada pinged me and said he wanted to come on camera and ask a question. So I want to invite Jean on, a friend of WITA's who we've had on before, and someone who I think has some interest in some of these topics. Jean, nice to see you.
I can. Hello, everybody, and thanks for this very interesting exchange of views. My question is the following, and it's to everyone on the panel, I guess. In a recently published research on solar suppliers in China, documents the setting up of separate production lines free from forced labor for goods bound for the US. The study's author, Johannes Bernreuther, said that, quote, solar products made with forced labor likely will be redirected to other places outside the US and most possibly inside China. This sounds like gaming the global system, and we might expect the same with carbon footprint. This green forced labor energy source will likely be used to back some products' manufacturing capacity that will eventually make its way to our markets as low carbon. In parallel, the export production line does nothing to counter the actual use of forced labor. The question is the following. Given that the actual focus on carbon taxes and the US's commitment to fight forced labor, shouldn't we consider the notion of traceable, responsible production in addition to the carbon footprint?
Who wants to jump in on that?
So I will, okay? Which is traceability here is absolutely critical. I mean, I think that's one of the things that is key as we look at this. And it's not just traceability in terms of the first stage, but you really ultimately need traceability down into the end good product in order to get there. So it's one thing to say, hey, we want to have a clean aluminum product or a clean steel product, and you can say I've produced this car with a clean product, right? But you can look at the steel, but can you look at the fourth level of part supplier down in China that was out there? And this has to be a requirement of any key system here. Now, you have this other issue of distortion and sorting of what I'll call sorting of product out there, and that's part of what needs to be addressed ultimately too. So you can't make this simplistically, I'll send the good stuff to the Europe or the United States or someplace that has a real requirement, and I'll keep the polluting stuff in name your country, right? I mean, that is a key part of this that is beyond, I think, the scope of, is part of further negotiations and beyond, has to be dealt with at some international level, because you're going to get a set of distortions no matter what. You can in this process.
Actually, Kim, I can come in on that
Yeah,
too.
please.
This is a key issue, and it's a key issue across, I think, all supply chains for a wide range of products. We're seeing this push for sustainable supply chains and responsible supply chains is gaining real steam. It's coming from consumers, it's coming from governments. Governments are looking at enforceable rules. Traceability will be key on that, and it's a challenge. So is avoiding diversion, for which you need a larger number of global players cooperating on that. So this is an issue we're looking at across all. And I think this is also the point that Alan made about the standards. What do you have to prove? How are you enforcing it? And this problem of visibility down the supply chain. One thing that COVID has done, though, is we've seen a huge increase in the attention of many firms to having greater visibility down to tier 3, tier 4 suppliers for a range of reasons, and that will also help with these issues.
And let me just jump in. This issue of traceability, when we started to look at sustainability a decade ago, when we were first looking at this, seemed vexing today with the way technology has evolved, there are pathways that I think that are out there, but it's going to require investment and government support to get there. Government support in terms of the right rules on a multilateral basis to get there.
And that goes back to how we make the definitions when we set up the rules and things. And, you know, the sustainable solutions go beyond carbon, obviously, to other type of things. And again, back to my 30-minute elevator speech, you know, we can all run out and claim the most clean, green material for our production next year, but at some point that all runs out. So we need a comprehensive solution to all of the problems.
Buddy, that's perfect transition. And first of all, I'm really glad about Jean's question and the answers you all gave, because it actually answered several of the questions in some ways that have come in. Lou Leibowitz asked one about downstream production. My own personal history, I worked on Capitol Hill in the 90s and was working on steel issues back then. And I remember this trade law issue of captive production. I'm sure Alan knows about that issue. And I worked on some things with Bob Lighthizer back in those days. And remember Angela Ellard, who's now at the OECD, came in to tell us what we were trying to do wasn't going to work. It was too complicated. She was right, by the way. Angela usually is. But some of the questions that have come in relate to whether or not we're going to have to, is this something that can be addressed at the WTO? Or is it something that really is going to have to be, you know, and multilaterally across a lot of sectors, or is it really going to have to be a sector-specific thing realistically to reach some of these kinds of agreements within the steel and aluminum sectors? Alan?
I guess I'll jump in first. Listen, we would all love for this to be able to be addressed at the WTO and at some type of comprehensive and reasoned negotiation. The failure of the Doha round basically shows that the difficulty that we will have in ever achieving that, and it's hard to see how we get to a comprehensive negotiation on subsidies, even among many of the countries that might seem to be somewhat aligned. That's been the trilateral efforts have been dragging on now for quite a while, and don't seem to honestly be getting very far. And it's I think that the sustainability efforts by the US and the EU are a potentially positive pathway, and we may need these pathways to be narrow. The problem is, how do you, if there's an attempt to try to justify them in current WTO rules, it's really going to be very difficult to put up, in essence, barriers against people who are not part of the club versus under current WTO rules that are actually, you know, saying you will have to, you know, if you will have to pay a duty, or you will have to be in a different, you will have to be excluded if you don't meet certain requirements out there. And so it's a vexing problem. And so you can talk about it sectorally, but it's not just a sectoral issue. It goes to sort of a fundamental issue that you know, ultimately, you know, has to happen. And one of the things I'll just say about the OECD is one of the reasons it has been a very useful institution, besides being a think tank, is because it has somewhat more like-minded countries together. You can at least have better, you know, cooperation and negotiations there to try to get to solutions where you can. So I don't have an answer, but I do recognize all the problems out there and look at them.
Julia, and then we'll go to Buddy.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think, well, you know, first I would say that, you know, if you work in the trade business, you have to believe in fairies to some extent. You know, you have to believe in hope for multilateral rules. But I think what you are seeing, realistically, life is messy. We're seeing a lot of sectoral initiatives. I mean, I think while multilateral rules are hard, sectoral initiatives are also proven to be very hard. So I think that where we are seeing it is perhaps more an emphasis on, as Alan said, initiatives amongst like-minded groups of countries, and that will take you some way, and it will address some issues, and it will create pressure which will then help you bring a wider group of countries to the table, because ultimately you do need that wider group of countries at the table if you're going to solve the global problem. So I think your strategy has to involve multiple prongs, and some of those are pressure in different forms, some of those are cooperation, some of those are dialogue, and some variable geometry. And it will not be easy and take some time, but I think we're not seeing, this is not an area where there's quick wins anywhere, I guess I would say.
Thank you, Buddy.
Yeah, I support everything that's been said, and truly that this is not a fast-moving solution. You ask about three things, I would say yes, yes, and yes. I think the basis of moving all of that forward has to be, the like-minded people working together to get a position on the table that can be discussed, and then use that to move the other two prongs along down the same path. But I think it really starts when you get a group that have like-minded thoughts, ambitions, and rules that can put something out there on the table that gets pushed forward.
Great. I'm going to read the next question because it's a little complicated, but if you guys will just bear with me. It comes from Rick Johnston. In the recent steel and aluminum Section 232 agreements reached between the US, EU, and Japan, there's reference to further negotiation of trade controls that would be applied to steel and aluminum trade with third parties based on carbon intensity of the product. How do the panelists see this playing out? What mechanisms do they think might be applied to measure such controls? And will it affect steel and aluminum trade flows? And might it be a model that could be replicated elsewhere? Anyone want to try to jump in on that one? Alan?
Okay, I guess I constantly move first here. Listen, Buddy, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Okay, listen, I think this negotiation is a positive and an attempt to try to start getting towards some solution sets that address sustainability in all of this. This is just at the beginning stages. If for those of us who are old enough to remember the Vietnam War, there was the negotiation of the shape of the peace conference table that took a while. At this point, people are just trying to figure out, and governments and companies with all good intentions, what is a measure of carbon intensity and what should they be using? Okay, I mean, these are really basic definitional issues, right? And then the next question is, what do we want to do to promote sustainability? Are there certain incentives that make sense and some that don't? Are we going to have carbon border adjustment measures or not as part of this? Are people who are part of this group, how are they treated under all of this? And all of these things are still to be evolved. And I think this is really at the very beginning stages. It is an ambitious schedule in many respects to get it done in 2 years, which is what I think the current scope is on this. But let us hold out hope, because I think, and as Julia points out, these are things that need to happen. Getting it done is going to be the challenge in all of this.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. It has been for years, Alan. Buddy.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, the first step you've seen there was the intention to link carbon and trade was really articulated in the US-EU agreement on Section 232 tariffs. It's really in the beginning stages. To finalize it in 18 to 24 months, you got to say, what's the long-term consequences to the end use of our products? And that's what I worry about.
We should all be thinking about that. Well, we're at our time. Did want to flag one other question. Maybe I'll bring in Ken Ash on this one. Wearing your current hat. No. This one is it's the one about. Does the US, EU, and even OECD have credibility on industrial subsidies when a lot of these governments are putting their subsidies in other areas. Agriculture subsidies remain in place in many areas. The U.S. is looking at new subsidies for semiconductors. You know, what does this mean? You know, can you have subsidies in one area and be talking about getting rid of them in another area? Like, how do you, if you can't do this comprehensively and multilaterally at the WTO, how do you have a straight face and just do it in these one sector or another?
So none of us have an entitlement to credibility and legitimacy and everything else. Okay, what I believe in, and I think what the institutions you refer to, I don't work for any of them anymore.
I know.
What they believe in is not philosophy and religion, but it's evidence. So what are the facts? So when I was with the OECD, when we worked on aluminium, that was not well received by everybody because it targeted one country, China. The report didn't target it. The support levels, the quantum, targeted the country. So what do you do with that? Do you publish it or do you hide it because one country is targeted? Well, you publish it. We have been abusing OECD countries on agricultural policies for 30 years. I have an op-ed out 2 days ago where I don't even work at the OECD. I'm continuing the abuse. So I think you know, if you like transparency, you like transparency across the board. And you know, as difficult an ask as it is, I think there's a better prospect to reform subsidies than there is to reform agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels, aluminium, semiconductors, or steel. And that's why, in fact, the WTO matters so much. Okay, because that's the house, that's the place that will, as Julia has said, you know, introduce the transparency, remedy, and prevent the next wave.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for the enthusiastic support for doing more at the WTO. Julia, do you want to jump in before we close up?
A very quick one, because it's a great question from Sean, as always. Yeah, look, we're an equal opportunity offender. And it's about pointing out this problem. In fact, one of the things we enjoy talking about at the moment is the lessons from agriculture for chip subsidies, because we're seeing a lot of parallels. So I think exactly the point that Ken made, that is precisely because there's no shortage of subsidizers across a lot of sectors. There's no shortage of people who don't have clean hands. And that's exactly, I think, the reason why you might get some progress on this issue, ultimately, the balance of pain and unhappiness. Thanks.
Well, thank you for your comments, Julia. Thank you, Buddy, for joining us. Alan, Julia, my good friend Ken Ash, really grateful to all of you for taking the time. Sorry we've run a little bit long. We generally don't like to do that, but there was a lot to talk about today. I really appreciate your joining us. Thank you to all of those who are tuned in. Let's pray together for the people of Ukraine. What's happening there is awful, and I know we're all thinking of that right now. Thank you all for joining us today, everyone, and stay safe and be well.
Thanks.